Pull up a seat, traveler, and listen close. The night is long out here in the high desert, and it's filled with stories. Tonight's tale is carved from the red rock of New Mexico, baked by its unforgiving sun, and stained with the blood of heroes and villains. It's a story about a town called Red Mesa, a town gasping for air under the boot of a devil named Cain Blackwood. It's a story of how, when hope has burned down to its last dying ember, sometimes something new rises from the ashes. The sun over Red Mesa was not a life-giving star but a malevolent eye, staring down without blinking until the very air buckled and shimmered. It baked the dust into a fine, brick-colored powder that coated every surface with a film of silent despair. This dust settled on the warped timbers of the boardwalk, filled the cracks in the sun-bleached sign for Miller's Mercantile, and clung to the sweat-soaked collars of the few souls who dared to scurry from one patch of shade to the next. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath, hunched beneath the colossal, blood-red mesas that loomed like ancient, sleeping giants, indifferent to the slow death happening in their shadow. Red Mesa was a town dying of thirst, but not for water. It was dying for lack of courage. The source of this sickness had a name, Cain Blackwood. He and his gang of 30-odd riders were not common bandits who struck and vanished. They were a permanent affliction, a parasitic growth that had latched onto the town's heart and was slowly, methodically draining it dry. They had seized control of the Agua Fria River upstream, the only reliable water source in a 50-mile radius, and their men guarded it day and night. Every rancher, every farmer, paid a tax in coin for every barrel they filled, a constant, humiliating reminder of their subjugation. Blackwood's protection fees were a joke as bitter as alkali dust. His men were the only threat the town faced. They were the wolves and the shepherds, and they charged for both services. Inside the sheriff's office, the air hung thick and motionless, smelling of stale coffee, old paper, and the dry rot of impotence. Sheriff Elias Thorne, a man whose 60 hard years were etched into the deep canyons of his face, stared out the window. The tin star pinned to his sweat-stained vest felt less like a badge of honor and more like the lid of a coffin he was already lying in. There was a time when the weight of it had been a comfort, a solid presence that connected him to the law, to order. Now, it was just a piece of metal, a hollow mockery of the authority he no longer possessed. His deputy, a boy of 19 named Billy, was currently sweeping the boardwalk with the kind of listless, defeated strokes that suggested he was merely rearranging the dust rather than removing it. Billy was a good boy, but he was afraid of loud noises and sudden movements, qualities ill-suited for his profession. Thorne knew they were a joke, a tired old man and a scared young boy, the last line of defense in a town that had already fallen. The final, bitter dreg of humiliation had been served up just an hour before. The incident hadn't been about money or supplies, it had been a pure, undiluted expression of power. Jedediah Jed Stone, Blackwood's brutish second-in-command, had ridden into town with 5 of his cronies. Jed was a man built like a brick outhouse, with a perpetually sneering lip and small, piggish eyes that glinted with casual cruelty. They had ridden directly to the Flores ranch on the edge of town. Maria Flores, a widow whose husband had been one of the last men to openly defy Blackwood 5 years ago, was the spine of Red Mesa's dwindling resistance. She was proud, unbent, and she owned a magnificent Andalusian stallion, a creature of midnight black grace and fire that was her late husband's pride and now her own. Jed had dismounted, declared the stallion was now the property of Cain Blackwood, and had his men put a rope on it. Maria had emerged from her house, a Winchester held loosely in her hands, her face a mask of cold fury. She hadn't raised the rifle, but her presence alone was a challenge. Thorne had watched from his window, his heart a cold knot in his stomach, as Jed laughed, strode up to her, and with a lazy, almost bored motion, backhanded her across the face. She had fallen into the dust, the rifle clattering beside her. The outlaws had mounted up, leading the screaming, fighting stallion away, their laughter echoing back across the plains. It was a message to everyone, even the strongest among you can be brought low. Your pride, your property, your dignity, it is all ours for the taking. Now, Maria stood before Sheriff Thorne's desk. A thin line of dried blood was traced from the corner of her lip to her chin. She hadn't bothered to wipe it away, she wore it like a testament. Her dark eyes, usually so full of life, burned with a feverish intensity. "So, that's it, Elias?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. That's all the law in Red Mesa is worth. The price of a good horse. Thorne couldn't meet her gaze. He stared at a crack in his oak desk, tracing its path with his eyes. Maria, you saw them. There were 6 of them, armed to the teeth. Billy and I. We would have been dead before our guns cleared leather. And would that have been so terrible? She shot back, the words striking him like stones. To die for something. To die standing up. It has to be better than this slow rot, this life on our knees. You wear that star, Elias. What does it mean if not to stand between the wolves and the sheep? It means I'm not a fool, he mumbled, the excuse tasting like ash in his mouth. I have to keep the peace. A shootout in the middle of town would have gotten innocent people killed. Innocent people are already dying, she said, her voice laced with contempt. They're just doing it quietly, inside their own homes, where your peace can't see them. You're not keeping the peace, Elias. You're managing a surrender. She turned on her heel, her spurs ringing in angry rhythm on the floorboards, and stormed out. The slam of the office door was like a gunshot, and it left the sheriff alone with the crushing weight of his own shame. It was into this suffocating silence, this vacuum of hope, that the stranger arrived. He came from the south, a direction few travelers used. At first, he was just a flicker in the heat haze, a dark distortion in the shimmering air that could have been a trick of the light. But the flicker grew, solidifying with an unnerving steadiness, resolving itself into the shape of a man on a horse. They moved as one, with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the oppressive heat. The horse was a magnificent beast, a deep chestnut stallion with muscles that coiled and uncoiled like powerful springs beneath a coat that shone like polished mahogany. It moved with a proud, intelligent bearing, its head high, its eyes watchful. But as magnificent as the animal was, it was the rider who commanded the landscape. He was a study in stark contrasts. He wore a long duster the color of ash, so dark it seemed to suck the very light out of the air, and a wide-brimmed, flat-crowned hat that was pulled low, casting his face in a permanent state of shadow. He sat tall in the saddle, his back ramrod straight, but there was no stiffness in him. He moved with the horse, a posture of perfect, relaxed control that suggested he had been born in the saddle. Strapped low on his right hip, tied down against his thigh, was a single, black-handled revolver. It was not the silver-inlaid showpiece of a dandy. The bluing was worn to a dull gray at the muzzle and along the cylinder. It was the tool of a master craftsman, and its craft was death. He rode down the center of the main street, his pace unhurried, deliberate. He didn't gawk or stare. His head moved with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm, his hidden eyes scanning everything layout of the streets, the rooftops, the dark spaces of the alleyways, the frightened faces that peeked from behind grubby window panes before quickly darting away. He was not a traveler passing through, he was a surveyor mapping a battlefield. He seemed to absorb the town's fear, to breathe it in, yet remain utterly untouched by it. He dismounted in front of the Thirsty Gulch Saloon, the only 2-story building in town. He swung a leg over the saddle with an athlete's economy of motion, his boots landing in the dust with a soft crunch. He tied the stallion's reins to the hitching post, his movements efficient and precise. Before turning away, he ran a gloved hand down the horse's neck, a brief, silent communion that spoke of a deep bond. As he turned toward the saloon, the angle of the sun shifted, and for the first time, his face was partially illuminated. It was not a young face. It looked as though it had been hewn from desert rock by a harsh wind, all sharp angles and unforgiving planes. His skin was tanned the color of old leather, and a thin, silvery scar sliced vertically through his right eyebrow, a permanent mark of some long-ago violence. But it was his eyes that arrested the gaze. They were a startlingly pale, cold gray, the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard. They held a look of such profound, unwavering focus, such an utter absence of doubt or fear, that it was like looking into the eyes of a hawk. They were the eyes of a man who had stripped his soul down to a single, terrible purpose. He pushed through the saloon's batwing doors, which groaned on their leather hinges. If the street outside was silent with fear, the saloon was silent with stagnation. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, and washed bodies, and cheap whiskey. 3 old prospectors, their dreams long since panned out, were hunched over their glasses at a corner table. The bartender, a portly man named Sam with a weary face and a stained apron, was wiping down the bar with a rag that had seen better decades. The The stranger walked to the bar, his spurs making no sound, a feat that required a specific, practiced gait. He didn't slide onto a stool. He stood before the bar, his presence seeming to shrink the room. "Whiskey," he said. His voice was a surprise. It was deep and quiet, a low rumble like distant thunder, yet every syllable was perfectly clear and carried to the furthest corner of the room. It was a voice that was not used to being ignored. Sam, the bartender, found himself moving before he'd consciously decided to. He grabbed a glass of the cleaner once and a bottle of the house rotgut. He poured a shot, his hand not quite steady under the stranger's unseen gaze. "On the house for a new face," Sam said, trying to sound welcoming, though his instincts were screaming at him. "Haven't seen you around these parts, stranger." The stranger picked up the glass, his gloved fingers wrapping around it. He didn't drink. He just held it, rolling the amber liquid around, his head tilted slightly as if listening to the silence. "New," he confirmed, his voice offering no further information. "Pleasure to have you. Just passing through on your way to Santa Fe, maybe," Sam pressed, his professional curiosity warring with a primal sense of self-preservation. The stranger finally lifted the glass to his lips, took a small sip, and set it down. His pale eyes met Sam's in the grimy back bar mirror. The intensity of the gaze made Sam's breath catch in his throat. "I'm looking for a man," the stranger said, his voice dropping a fraction, becoming even more resonant. "Rides with a gang of cutthroats. Calls himself Cain Blackwood." The name landed in the dead air of the saloon with the physical impact of a stone. One of the old prospectors actually flinched, spilling his drink. Sam went pale, and the rag in his hand stopped its circular motion. The very temperature of the room seemed to drop. "In Red Mesa, you didn't speak the devil's name out loud, for fear he might appear." "Friend," Sam said, his voice now a strained, urgent whisper, leaning forward over the bar. "Take some free advice. That's a name you forget you ever knew. You turn around, get on that fine horse of yours, and you ride until this town is just a bad memory. Looking for Cain Blackwood in this territory. Well, that makes you one of two things. Either you're a damn fool, or you're a man with a powerful urge to be buried." The stranger turned slowly on his heel, his entire body moving as a single, fluid unit. He faced the bartender directly, and the full force of his wintry gaze fell upon him. For the first time, a flicker of something that looked like fire, a spark of some ancient, banked inferno, glowed deep within his eyes. He placed a silver dollar on the wet bar, the clink of it unnaturally loud. "I'm neither," he said, his voice as cold and final as a eulogy. "I'm a reckoning." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the coin, his nearly full glass, and a terrified silence in his wake. He stepped back out into the brutal and forgiving sunlight, his gaze lifting toward the colossal red mesas that ringed the valley. He stood there for a long moment, a solitary, half-colored figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. No one knew his name. No one knew his past. But as the sun beat down on the hopeless town of Red Mesa, a single, impossible thought took root in the minds of those who watched him from the shadows. A prayer had not been answered. But something far more dangerous had just arrived. The stranger's single, declarative statement in the Thirsty Gulch Saloon, "I'm a reckoning," did not explode through Red Mesa. It seeped into the town's consciousness like slow-acting poison into a diseased body. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly unbelievable concept. Reckonings were for other places, for dime novels and whispered legends. Red Mesa was a place for enduring, not for fighting back. And yet, the stranger's presence was an undeniable fact, a dark granite boulder that had suddenly appeared in the middle of a well-worn path of despair. He took a room on the second floor of the boarding house run by the widow Gable, a woman whose stern face was a mask for a perpetually fluttering heart. He paid for a week in advance, laying 7 heavy silver dollars on her worn countertop. The coins were old, minted in Carson City, and they felt like they carried the weight of 100 grim transactions. He gave no name, simply signing the register with a single, sharp X. Mrs. Gable, who prided herself on knowing the business of everyone under her roof, found herself utterly incapable of asking for one look into those pale, wintry eyes, which seemed to see right through her questions to the fear behind them, and she simply handed him the key to room number 3. He became a fixture of quiet menace. For hours, he would sit in a rocking chair on the boarding house's shaded porch, his chair facing the main street. He rarely moved, save for the slow, methodical process of cleaning his black-handled Colt, the pieces laid out on a square of oilcloth on his lap. He seemed idle, yet he was not. His stillness was that of a predator in a blind, a state of absolute awareness. His gaze, shielded by the shadow of his hat, was a constant, sweeping presence. He tracked the nervous, scurrying movements of the townsfolk, noting who was brave and who was broken. He watched Deputy Billy make his twice-daily, pointless patrol. He observed the patterns of the sun and shadow, marking the dark alleyways and the exposed rooftops, mapping the town in his mind not as a place to live, but as a place to fight. And always, his attention would drift back to the dusty, heat-shimmered trail that led east, the direction from which evil always came. The town held a collective, anxious breath. The stranger whom children were now whispering was a ghost, and their parents were praying was a savior was a catalyst. His very existence was a challenge to the established order of suffering. Hope, an emotion so long dormant it felt alien and dangerous, began to germinate in the cracked soil of Red Mesa's soul. It was a tiny, fragile thing, a whisper of embers in a town that had grown cold. It was seen in the way Mr. Miller the storekeeper held his head a little higher, in the way Sheriff Thorne spent a little longer staring at the shotgun in his office rack, and in the way Maria Flores began to organize the other ranchers, speaking in low, urgent tones about banding together. The stranger had done nothing but arrive, and yet, everything had changed. The test, as everyone knew it must, came 3 days later. The air was thick and still, the sky a bleached, hazy white. Right on schedule, a trio of Blackwood's riders appeared on the eastern trail, their forms slowly resolving out of the heat. It was Jed Stone, his brutish face set in its customary sneer, flanked by 2 other hard-faced men. Jed's right hand was wrapped in a crude, dirty bandage, a souvenir from a barroom brawl in another town, a testament to his casual violence. They rode with the unhurried swagger of landlords coming to collect rent from tenants they despised. They ignored the saloon, heading straight for Miller's Mercantile. Jed didn't bother to dismount. He spurred his horse right up onto the boardwalk, a blatant act of intimidation, the animal's hoofs clattering like gunshots on the wood. He kicked the shop door open with his boot, the bell above it jangling in a frantic, terrified alarm. "Miller, tribute time," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the naturally silent street. From the dark interior of the store, Mr. Miller emerged, his small frame seeming to shrink even further. He was a man made of apologies and fear, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. In his trembling hands, he held a small cloth bag. The jingle of the coins inside was a pathetic, meager sound. Jed leaned down from his saddle, a giant looming over a mouse, and snatched the bag. He weighed it in his huge palm, his face twisting in contempt. "This feels light, Miller," he growled. "Business slow. Or are you holding out on the boss?" "No, sir, Mr. Stone." "Truly," Miller stammered, wringing his hands. "It's been a hard week. It's all I have." "Maybe you ain't motivated enough," Jed sneered. He looked at his companions. "Maybe we need to remind Mr. Miller about the cost of doing business." He swung his leg over the saddle, dropping heavily to the boardwalk. He strode into the store. A moment later, there was a tremendous crash sound of an entire shelf of goods being swept to the floor. Glass shattered, cans clattered, and rolled across the floorboards. Jed's cruel laughter boomed out from the store's interior. The sound acted like a summons. On the porch of the boarding house, the stranger slowly, deliberately, reassembled his Colt. The final click as the cylinder locked into place was crisp and final. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He didn't run. He didn't even hurry. He stepped off the porch and began to walk across the street, his ash-colored duster billowing gently behind him. His steps were measured, rhythmic, the soft crunch of his boots in the dust like the ticking of a clock counting down to a final, violent second. He entered the Mercantile just as Jed was raising a meaty hand to the cowering Mr. Miller. The 3 outlaws turned, startled by his sudden, silent appearance. He seemed to draw all the light from the doorway, a figure of pure shadow and menace. Jed's eyes narrowed, his gaze falling from the stranger's impassive face to the black-handled Colt now resting in its holster, and then back up. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features. "Well now, "Who's this?" Jed sneered, trying to recover his bravado. "Lost your way, friend. This is private business." The stranger's pale gray eyes were fixed solely on Jed, ignoring the other two men completely. The look in them was utterly devoid of emotion. It was the look a man might give an insect before crushing it. "Picking on old men," the stranger said, his quiet voice an unnerving counterpoint to Jed's bluster. "Stealing from the desperate. Is that the kind of work Kane Blackwood has his top man doing these days?" The mention of the boss's name, spoken with such casual contempt, and the sarcastic title of top man, turned Jed's face a mottled shade of red. "You got a real smart mouth, friend," he snarled, taking a threatening step forward, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his own pistol. "And a death wish. Nobody talks about the boss like that. Now, I'm gonna ask you one time to turn around and walk out of here before you get taught a lesson in respect. Who the hell are you, anyway?" "I'm the man telling you to pick up every last can you knocked over," the stranger said, his voice dropping even lower, yet it seemed to gain in intensity, each word a carefully placed stone. "Then you'll give Mr. Miller his money back. And then you and your friends will get on your horses and ride out of this town." He took a single, deliberate step into the store. "And I won't tell you again." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of the command hung in the air. Jed's two companions stared, their mouths agape, before breaking into nervous, incredulous grins. Jed himself let out a short, barking laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. You're gonna make me," he choked out. "You hear this, boys? He thinks he's gonna make me. You and what army, you crazy son of a bitch?" "For the likes of you," the stranger replied, his voice as cold as a January wind, "I don't need an army." The world seemed to contract, the universe shrinking to the space between the two men. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight seemed to freeze. Jed's sneer vanished, replaced by a mask of pure rage. His pride, his authority, had been challenged in front of his men. There was only one way this could end. "That's it," Jed hissed, his knuckles white where his hand hovered over his gun. "You just talked yourself 6 feet under." Jed's hand moved. It was a blur, the practiced motion of a bully who had used the threat of his gun to get his way for years. But it was the motion of a bully, not a gunfighter. It was just a fraction too slow, a hair too wide. The stranger's hand was a different thing entirely. It wasn't just motion, it was an act of pure, distilled purpose. It was a streak of shadow, a whisper of movement so economical and so swift it seemed to defy the laws of physics. The black-handled Colt seemed not to be drawn, but to simply materialize in his hand. There was a single, deafening boom that shook the very foundations of the store. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder instantly filled the air. Jed screamed. It was a high, piercing shriek of agony and disbelief. He stared at his right hand as if it belonged to someone else. His pistol was gone, sent cartwheeling through the air to land with a thud in a barrel of flour, coating it in a white shroud. His hand was a mangled, bloody mess. The stranger's bullet had not hit him, it had hit the hammer of his own gun with such perfect, impossible precision that the resulting explosion of metal had shattered the weapon and the bones of the hand holding it. He staggered back, clutching the ruined, bleeding limb to his chest, his face the color of spoiled milk, his eyes wide with shock and a new, terrifying emotion, fear. The other two outlaws stood as if turned to stone, their hands frozen halfway to their own pistols. They stared, paralyzed, at the stranger. He hadn't moved from his spot. The smoking Colt was still in his hand, now leveled directly at the space between their eyes. His expression had not changed. His pale, wintry gaze held them pinned, 2 insects under glass. "I believe," the stranger said, his voice a lethal whisper that cut through Jed's agonized whimpers, "my instructions were clear." Terror, sharp and absolute, finally broke the outlaws' paralysis. They scrambled, not for their guns, but for their wounded leader. They half-carried, half-dragged the howling Jed Stone out of the mercantile, their eyes wide with panic, never once turning their backs on the still, silent figure in the doorway. They fumbled to get him onto his horse, then mounted their own and spurred their animals into a frantic, dust-churning gallop, fleeing Red Mesa as if the devil himself were snapping at their heels. The stranger stood motionless for a long beat, the smoke curling from the barrel of his gun like a departing spirit. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he ejected the spent casing, which tinkled on the floorboards. He holstered the pistol in one smooth motion. He walked over to the counter, bent down, and picked up the small bag of tribute money from where Jed had dropped it. He placed it gently on the counter in front of Mr. Miller, who was leaning against a shelf, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then, without another word, without a glance at the stunned and grateful shopkeeper, the stranger turned and walked back out into the sun-drenched street, leaving behind him a cloud of gun smoke, the smell of violence, and the town's collective, disbelieving awe. The whisper of embers had been fanned by a sudden, violent gust of wind, and for the first time in a very long time, it glowed with the bright, dangerous, and beautiful promise of a fire. The story of Jed Stone's humiliation did more than just spread through Red Mesa. It detonated. It was recounted with wide-eyed, breathless excitement in the saloon, whispered with a mixture of fear and glee over fences, and debated in hushed, serious tones in the sheriff's office. For years, the only stories in Red Mesa had been of defeat and capitulation. This was a new and intoxicating vintage. The stranger hadn't just won a fight. He had performed a miracle of impossible speed and precision. He hadn't killed Jed Stone. He had unmanned him, surgically removing his power and his pride with a single, perfectly placed bullet. He had demonstrated a level of skill so far beyond the brutish thuggery of Blackwood's men that it seemed almost supernatural. This stranger, whom the townspeople were now universally calling the Phoenix, a name that had sprung from some unknown source and seemed to fit him perfectly, had lit a fuse. The entire town was now poised, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Cain Blackwood was a man whose entire empire was built on a foundation of absolute and questioned fear. An act of public defiance was not just an insult, it was a crack in that foundation, a threat to his very existence. Retaliation would not be a matter of if, but of when, and how brutal. The answer came 2 days later, just as the midday sun reached its zenith, bleaching all color from the sky. A lookout, stationed in the church bell tower at Maria Flores' suggestion, sounded the alarm. A thick plume of dust was rising from the east, far larger than the one made by Jed's trio of riders. This was not a collection party. This was a war party. Blackwood had received the news of Jed's maiming with a chilling, predatory calm. He had listened to the terrified, stammering report from the other 2 riders, his dark eyes betraying nothing. When they were finished, he had simply walked over to the whimpering Jed, looked at his shattered hand, and said, "You have outlived your usefulness." A single gunshot had echoed through his mission fortress. He was intrigued by this Phoenix, but his primary emotion was fury. An example had to be made, not just of the man, but of the entire town that had dared to witness his gang's humiliation. He dispatched a unit of 5 of his most ruthless killers. Their leader was a man named Marcus Riker, a cold-blooded ex-cavalry scout with a jagged scar down his face and a reputation for enjoying his work. Their orders were simple and cruel: ride into Red Mesa, burn the livery stable to the ground as a public lesson in obedience, find the man in the ash-colored duster, and drag him back to the fortress alive, if possible. Blackwood wanted the pleasure of looking this man in the eye before he personally extinguished his life. As Riker's posse rode into view, Red Mesa transformed. The nascent courage of the past 2 days curdled into stark terror. The streets emptied in a heartbeat. Doors were slammed shut, bars dropped into place, and heavy wooden shutters were closed over windows. The town once again became a ghost town, a collection of silent, watching buildings. In his office, Sheriff Thorne chambered around into his shotgun, the shuck-shuck sound loud in the silence. He knew it was a futile gesture, but it was a gesture he had to make. Beside him, Deputy Billy held a pistol with both hands, his knuckles white. But the Phoenix was not hiding. He was waiting. He had watched the dust cloud approach with the calm certainty of a man who knew his destiny had come for him. He stood in the dead center of the main street, a solitary, defiant figure, a monolith of black against the pale dust. His duster stirred in the hot breeze that always preceded a storm. It was a classic Western tableau, an image torn from a dime novel, yet the threat of death was utterly, terrifyingly real. Riker and his 4 riders reined in their horses 20 yards from the lone man, their animals nervous, sensing the tension in the air. The 5 outlaws were a grim gallery of frontier predators, their faces hard, their eyes merciless. "You the one they're calling Phoenix?" Riker snarled, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered cavalry pistol. The Phoenix didn't answer the question. His gaze was fixed on Riker, his face an unreadable mask beneath the shadow of his hat. Doesn't matter, Riker continued, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. The boss, Mr. Blackwood, he wants a word with you. You can come on your own horse, or we can sling your carcass over one. Makes no difference to us. The Phoenix's hand, which had been hanging loosely at his side, came to rest lightly on the black handle of his Colt. Blackwood wants to see me, he said, his voice as calm and clear as a bell in the oppressive silence. He can come himself. Riker's scarred lips twisted into a cruel smile. Wrong answer. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men. Take him. They spurred their horses simultaneously, a practiced maneuver, fanning out to approach him from different angles, intending to surround and overwhelm him. They drew their pistols, expecting an easy fight, a single man against 5 guns. They, like Jed Stone before them, had made the fatal error of believing what their eyes told them. The Phoenix did not wait for them to close the distance. The instant they committed, the instant their horses surged forward, he exploded into a symphony of controlled, lethal violence. His Colt was in his hand, a seamless extension of his will, barking fire before the Outlaws could properly level their own weapons. The first shot was for Riker. The bullet took the leader square in the chest, a powerful .45 slug that lifted him from the saddle and threw him backward onto the dusty street with the finality of a slammed door. The second and third shots were a fluid, continuous motion, a testament to years of relentless practice. His arm barely seemed to move as he tracked his next 2 targets. He didn't aim for kills, he aimed for efficiency. The second rider was picked off his horse with a shot through the shoulder, his scream swallowed by the roar of the gun. The third man clutched his leg, a clean shot shattering his femur and sending him toppling sideways. 2 more threats, neutralized instantly. The remaining 2 riders, their minds struggling to process the sudden, catastrophic turn of events, finally opened fire. Their shots were wild, panicked. Bullets kicked up angry spurts of dust at the Phoenix's feet and whizzed past his head with a sound like angry hornets. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to notice. In a motion of pure instinct, he dropped to one knee, making himself a smaller target, the ash duster pooling around him. He raised his Colt with both hands, steadying his aim for a split second. Boom! The fourth shot took the horse of one of the remaining riders in the chest. The great animal let out a terrible, piercing scream and went down headfirst, its rider's leg trapped beneath its weight in a tangle of leather and broken bone. The final outlaw, his nerve completely shattered, saw only death. He yanked his horse's reins, turning to flee, to escape the impossible, lawmen army. But the Phoenix's last shot was a masterpiece of grim artistry. The bullet crossed the rapidly increasing distance and struck the fleeing man in the back of the shoulder, just below the neck. The impact spun him around in the saddle as if he were atop, and he slid limply to the ground, his face plowing a furrow in the dust. It was over. The entire gunfight had lasted less than 10 seconds. 5 armed men on horseback, 5 shots, 5 downed outlaws. The silence that crashed down in the aftermath was more profound than the noise it replaced. It was broken only by the agonized groans of the wounded, the pathetic whimpering of the man trapped under his dead horse, and the nervous snorting of a riderless mount. The Phoenix rose slowly to his feet, the barrel of his Colt still smoking, a thin, gray tendril reaching for the sky. He walked forward, his boots crunching in the dust, a slow, deliberate pace. He was no longer a man, he was the personification of a final judgment. He moved among the wounded and dying men, kicking their fallen pistols away from their reach. He stopped and knelt beside the dying Riker, who was clutching his chest, a frothy bubble of blood on his lips. "Give your boss a message from me," the Phoenix said, his voice a low, chilling whisper meant only for the dying man. Riker coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Go to hell," he gasped. "He'll be there soon enough to welcome me," the Phoenix replied, his face inches from the Outlaws. A flicker of some terrible, ancient pain surfaced in his pale eyes. "You tell him. The fire he started in Whisper Creek is coming back to burn him down. You tell him Elias is back." He saw the flicker of recognition in Riker's eyes, a final flash of understanding and terror, before the light in them went out forever. The Phoenix stood up, the name Elias hanging in the superheated air like a ghost's accusation. He looked at the carnage he had wrought, at the bodies bleeding into the thirsty dust of Red Mesa. This was not a victory. It was a declaration. The first spark had become a roaring blaze, and now the whole world knew his name. From the window of her ranch house on the edge of town, Maria Flores lowered the rifle she had been holding, her knuckles white. She hadn't fired a shot, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her war had just begun. The town had a choice to make, and it had to make it now. Live in fear, or die for a chance at freedom. The gunfight on Main Street was not an end, but a beginning. The silence it left behind was profound, a vacuum into which the town's future would be decided. For a long minute, Red Mesa was a still life painting of the aftermath of violence. 5 downed men, 3 dead or dying, 2 riderless horses skittering nervously, and a lone, black-clad figure standing amidst it all, the smoke still curling from his gun. Then, slowly, tentatively, doors began to open. Shutters creaked aside. Faces, pale with a mixture of terror and awe, emerged from the shadows. They did not cheer. The reality of the violence was too raw, too immediate. Instead, they stared, first at the bodies, then at the man who had created them. He was no longer just the phoenix. He was a tangible, lethal force. He was the answer to a prayer they had been too afraid to utter, and the answer was terrifying. That evening, as the desert sky turned a bruised purple, a delegation of 3 approached the boarding house. They did not come to question or to accuse, but to pledge allegiance. The first was Maria Flores, who had ridden in from her ranch. She carried her Winchester not as a threat, but as a tool she was now prepared to use. Her face, in the fading light, was stripped of all fear, hardened into a mask of grim determination. The second was Doc Miller, the town's physician, a man whose gentle hands had spent the afternoon pulling lead from the flesh of Blackwood's men. His white shirt was stained with their blood, and his eyes, usually full of a weary compassion, held a new, steely resolve. The third was Ben Carter, the blacksmith. A mountain of a man with arms as thick as wagon axles, Ben was a man of few words, his silence a deep well of simmering anger. He had watched for years as Blackwood's men mistreated his neighbors, his rage building with each fresh indignity. The gunfight had been the hammer strike that had finally forged it into a weapon. They found Elias on the porch, not cleaning his gun, but staring out at the mesas, now black silhouettes against the dying light. He seemed a part of the encroaching darkness, a man communing with his own ghosts. "We don't know your name," Maria said, her voice steady, "though we heard the one you gave to Riker. We don't know where you came from, or why this is your fight. And right now, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it's our fight, too. Red Mesa is our home. We were letting it die. No more." Elias turned his head slowly, his pale eyes assessing each of them in turn. He saw past their words to the truth beneath. He saw the fierce, protective fire in Maria's eyes, the bone-deep weariness and newfound purpose in the Doc's, and the slow-burning, unbreakable strength in the blacksmith's gaze. For the first time since he had ridden into this town, he let the mask of the cold avenger slip, just for a fraction of an inch. He saw in their faces the ghosts of other faces from another time, another life. He saw the same desperate courage, the same refusal to be broken, that he had once seen in his neighbors in a green valley far from here. "What do you need from us?" Ben Carter rumbled, the question a simple, direct offer of strength. Elias was silent for a long moment, the prairie wind whistling softly through the porch railings. "Ammunition," he said finally, his voice a low gravel. "Every bullet in this town. Information on Blackwood's numbers and the layout of his fortress. And a place to think, where the walls don't have ears." Later that night, they gathered in the blacksmith's forge. The great doors were barred, the only light coming from the dying orange glow of the coals in the forge. The air was thick with the honest, elemental smells of coal smoke, hot iron, and sweat. It was a place of creation and destruction, a fitting sanctuary for the birth of a rebellion. Surrounded by the tools of Ben's trade, hammers, tongs, and anvils that could shape steel, Elias finally allowed the past to claim him. The battle in the street, the act of speaking his own name, had unlocked a door in his mind he had kept bolted for 5 agonizing years. The glow of the coals blurred, and in their depths he saw another fire, a hungrier and more terrible fire that had consumed his entire world. Flashback. The place was called Whisper Creek. The name itself was a promise of peace, a green, fertile valley nestled in the protective embrace of the Colorado Mountains. It wasn't a town of dusty streets and desperate saloons. It was a patchwork of homesteads, a community built from the ground up by settlers with faith in the soil and in each other. And Elias Thorne was not a ghost haunted by vengeance. He was a rancher, a husband, and a father. He was a man whose laughter came easily, whose hands were calloused from building fences and delivering calves, not from drawing a gun. His life was a simple, beautiful trinity: his wife, Sarah, a woman whose smile could make wildflowers grow and whose laugh sounded like wind chimes; his 7-year-old son, Daniel, a boy with a shock of unruly black hair; his mother's smile, and his father's serious, watchful gray eyes; and the land itself, which he loved with a deep, abiding passion. Their nearest neighbor, their partner, their friend, was Cain Blackwood. He was not yet the monster who ruled Red Mesa. He was a man of immense charm and boundless ambition, with a preacher's gift for painting pictures of a glorious future with his words. He and Elias had discovered the valley together, had been the first to put down stakes. They were brothers in every sense but blood, their ranches adjoining, their families inseparable. Cain was the visionary, the one who spoke of bringing the railroad through the valley, of building a school, a church, a city. Elias was the foundation, the quiet, steady man whose hard work and pragmatism turned Cain's grand visions into reality. Elias was the roots, Cain was the branches reaching for the sun. The serpent that entered their Eden was gold. A lone prospector, passing through, had discovered a rich vein of it in the hills that formed the valley's western wall. It wasn't a motherlode, not the kind that started a rush, but it was significant, more than enough to poison a man's soul. According to the land charter that Elias, as the town's official founder, had filed with the territorial government, all mineral rights belonged to the owners of the land on which they were found. The gold was the property of the community. That was when the first cracks in the brotherhood appeared. Cain saw the gold not as a blessing for all, but as an opportunity for the few, namely, the two of them. He argued passionately, his eyes alight with a feverish gleam Elias had never seen before. They should use their combined wealth to buy out the other homesteaders, offering them a fair price before the news of the gold got out. Consolidate the land, take the wealth, and build their city on a foundation of gold. Elias was appalled. He refused, his quiet resolve an immovable object against the force of Cain's ambition. The valley was a promise they had made to everyone who settled there. It was a community of families, not a corporation. The refusal was a turning point. Friendship curdled into resentment in Cain's heart. He began to see Elias not as his brother, but as an obstacle. The other homesteaders were no longer neighbors, but impediments to his glorious destiny. His ambition, now twisted by greed, became a cancer. He made a deal with the devil, riding out and hiring a band of ruthless mercenaries, the kind of men who kill for coin and ask no questions. The attack came on the night of the harvest moon, under the cover of a raging thunderstorm that masked the sounds of their approach. It was not a raid for supplies or livestock. It was a methodical, systematic extermination. They swept through the valley like a firestorm, their torches painting hellish scenes against the rain-lashed darkness. Homes became infernos, barns became slaughterhouses. Elias was woken by Sarah's scream and the terrible, roaring sound of his own house catching fire. He grabbed the rifle he kept by the bed and fought with the ferocity of a cornered grizzly defending his cubs. He killed 2 of the mercenaries in the fiery chaos of his own living room before a bullet tore through his side, a searing, white-hot pain. As he staggered, another bullet grazed his temple, slicing through his eyebrow and sending him crashing into a world of blackness. The last thing he saw, through the window, illuminated by a flash of lightning and the horrific, dancing flames of his own burning home, was a silhouette. It was the figure of his best friend, his brother, Cain Blackwood, sitting on his horse on a nearby hill, watching the destruction he had orchestrated, his face serene and triumphant, like a Roman emperor watching a city burn. He awoke hours later to a dawn of ash and silence. The rain had passed, leaving behind a world of gray ruin and the sickening smell of burnt wood and flesh. The valley was gone. His ranch was a smoking skeleton. He crawled through the wreckage of his home, calling their names, his voice a raw, broken whisper. He found them together, where they had fallen near the root cellar door. Sarah and Daniel. He had lost everything. The man known as Elias Thorne's husband, the father, the rancheried in that valley of ashes. From that fire, something else was born. A creature of cold, single-minded purpose. A ghost animated by a single vow, sworn on the marked graves of his wife and son. He would become a weapon. He would hunt Cain Blackwood to the ends of the earth. He would be the fire that cleansed the world of his evil. He took the name Phoenix, for he had been reborn in the flames of his own annihilation. For 5 long, brutal years, he had drifted, trained, and hunted, and the trail, cold for so long, had finally led him here, to the dust and despair of Red Mesa. End flashback. Elias opened his eyes. The forge was dark, the coals now just a faint, dying red. His face was wet with tears. He hadn't realized he was crying. The pain was as raw and fresh as it had been on that first morning. Ben Carter stood in the doorway, a dark, silent shape. He held a newly forged Bowie knife, its long, heavy blade gleaming dully in the faint light. He didn't offer condolences or ask questions. He understood that this was a grief too deep for words. He simply held out the knife. Elias took it. The weight of the perfectly balanced steel felt solid and real in his hand, a tangible anchor in a sea of ghosts. He was no longer just a man seeking vengeance for personal loss. The ghosts of Whisper Creek had found common cause with the desperate souls of Red Mesa. His war had become their war, and he would see it through to its bitter, bloody end. The news of the disastrous gunfight reached Cain Blackwood's fortress like a shockwave. It wasn't just the loss of 5 men, including a trusted lieutenant like Riker. It was the message that came with them, delivered by the terrified, wounded outlaw Elias had allowed to live. He said, "The fire of Whisper Creek is coming for you." The man had stammered, his eyes wide with the remembered terror. He said, "His name is Elias." Cain's fortress was a repurposed Spanish mission that sat atop a high, flat plateau known as Serpent's Tooth. It was a formidable bastion of thick adobe walls and stone towers, a near-impregnable fortress from which he ruled his small, brutal empire. Inside its walls, he lived like a feudal lord, surrounded by the spoils of his conquests and men whose loyalty was bought with coin and maintained by fear. He was a handsome man, his dark hair elegantly touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes held the intense, mesmerizing power of a revivalist preacher. This charisma was his most dangerous weapon. It allowed him to cloak his monstrous ambition in the language of destiny and progress. The name Elias did not stir guilt in Cain's heart. Guilt was a luxury he had long since discarded. Instead, it ignited a cold, intellectual fury. Elias was a loose end, a ghost from a past he had meticulously tried to erase. A ghost who had now materialized and was threatening to unravel the entire tapestry of his power. He stood on the parapet of his mission, looking east toward the distant, hazy smudge that was Red Mesa. Jedstone's maimed, useless form, a pathetic reminder of his failure in the courtyard below. Blackwood was a student of strategy. He knew that a direct, full-frontal assault on Red Mesa now, against a man of Elias's proven skill, would be costly. The town, inspired by their new Phoenix, would fight back. Men would be lost, ammunition wasted. It would be a messy, brutish affair. Cain preferred the elegance of a perfectly executed plan, the cold, clean logic of breaking an enemy's will before breaking his body. He would not break his army against the town's walls. He would make the town tear its own walls down. His wrath, therefore, was not a hot, impulsive thing, but a cold, suffocating one. His strategy was simple. He would choke Red Mesa to death. The morning after the gunfight, he dispatched a small team of men not to the town, but several miles upstream on the Agua Fria River. These were not gunfighters, they were miners who knew how to handle dynamite. With a series of carefully placed charges, they brought a section of the canyon wall crashing down into the riverbed. The explosions echoed through the desert like a declaration of war. The rock slide created a massive, impassable dam, and the flow of water to Red Mesa was reduced from a steady, life-giving stream to a muddy, pathetic trickle. The effect on the town was immediate and catastrophic. The water level in the cisterns and wells began to drop at an alarming rate. A quiet, desperate panic set in. Water, once taken for granted, became the most precious commodity in the world, more valuable than gold. People began hoarding, eyeing their neighbors' barrels with suspicion. Blackwood's next target was their food. 2 days later, a pillar of thick, greasy black smoke was seen rising from the west, from the direction of Maria Flores' ranch. Maria, watching from her porch, felt a cold dread grip her heart. She saddled her horse and rode out, already knowing what she would find. Blackwood's men hadn't attacked her home or her cattle directly. They had done something far more insidious. They had set fire to the vast grasslands where she grazed her herd, and more importantly, they had torched the massive hay stores she had spent all summer cutting and storing for the winter. Without that feed, her cattle, the primary source of meat for the entire town, would starve or have to be sold off for pennies. The fire raged for a day and a night, a funeral pyre for the town's security. The psychological warfare was just as relentless. Blackwood understood that fear was a far more potent weapon than bullets. At night, his riders would appear on the mesas surrounding the town, their forms silhouetted against the moonlit sky. They would not attack. They would simply sit there, dark sentinels of doom, their presence a constant, unnerving reminder of the town's isolation and vulnerability. Sometimes, they would let out a chilling, coyote-like howl, a sound that frayed nerves and made sleep an impossibility. The final turn of the screw came a week into the siege. A prospector, one of the old men from the saloon, who had foolishly tried to sneak out of town to get to his claim, was captured. The next morning, the townspeople awoke to a gruesome sight. The old man was tied to the bullet-riddled "Welcome to Red Mesa" sign. He was alive, but barely. His body was a testament to Blackwood's cruelty, a canvas of pain and suffering meant to be read by every man, woman, and child. He had been left as a living scarecrow, a warning against any further defiance. Blackwood's strategy was a masterclass in cruelty, and it was devastatingly effective. The town's newfound courage began to sour into finger-pointing and resentment. The unity forged in the heat of the gunfight began to crack under the cold, relentless pressure of thirst and hunger. Fights broke out at the communal well as the water level dropped. The whispers started, quiet at first, then growing louder. "This is his fault. Blackwood left us alone before he came. We were surviving. Now, he's going to get us all killed." The town was on the brink of implosion. It was turning on itself, the bonds of community dissolving in the acid of fear. Elias, the Phoenix, was no longer seen as a savior by all, but as the catalyst for their destruction. This was precisely what Cain had planned. He had Red Mesa in a chokehold, and he was slowly, patiently, squeezing the life out of it, confident that soon the desperate, terrified townspeople would deliver Elias to him on a platter, begging for mercy. The battle for Red Mesa was no longer a contest of speed or accuracy, but a war for the town's very soul. The town was dying on its feet, and the stench of its decay was the smell of fear. The camaraderie born from the gunfight had evaporated under the relentless sun, replaced by the acrid smoke of suspicion and despair. The water in the central well was now a shallow, muddy puddle, doled out by the cupful under the armed guard of Sheriff Thorne, whose face had aged a decade in a week. The children were silent, their games forgotten, their eyes large and haunted. The town was a powder keg of desperation, and Elias knew a single spark would ignite it. That spark came during a town meeting in the Thirsty Gulch Saloon. The place was packed, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and raw panic. Elias stood at the front, flanked by a grim-faced Maria and Ben Carter, trying to outline a plan for rationing, for survival. But the people were past listening to plans. They wanted a release for their terror, and he was the target. Rationing, a man named Henderson, who owned the dry goods store, shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "My boy is sick with a fever and you're talking about rationing water. This is your fault. You rode in here, you brought this down on us. Blackwood was content to bleed us slow. You invited him to cut our throats." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Another man, a rancher whose grazing land had been torched, stood up, his face contorted with grief and anger. "My herd's finished. Everything I worked for my whole life, gone up in smoke. For what? So you can settle some old score. This ain't our fight. It's yours. You should be the one to face him. Ride out there alone and leave the rest of us out of it." The sentiment was an ugly, infectious disease, spreading through the room. The people, in their terror, were turning on their only hope, looking for a sacrifice to appease the angry god on the mesa. Elias stood silent, letting their fear wash over him. He did not get angry. He saw in their faces the same desperate panic he had seen in the eyes of his neighbors in Whisper Creek just before the end. He saw how easily fear could turn good people into a mob. Before he could speak, Maria Flores stepped forward, her Winchester held across her chest. She was not a large woman, but in that moment, she seemed to fill the room. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the din like a razor. "Listen to yourselves," she commanded, her dark eyes sweeping across the crowd, penning each man with her gaze. "Just listen. You talk about surviving before he came. Was that what you call it? Paying a man to drink your own water? Handing over your hard-earned money so his thugs don't burn your homes? Watching your neighbors get beaten in the street and turning away? You weren't surviving. You were dying. You were just doing it slowly enough that you could pretend it was living." She took a step forward, her voice dropping, becoming more personal, more shaming. "This man," she said, gesturing to Elias, "came here and he reminded you that you had spines. He taught you how to stand up. And the second it gets hard, the second there's a price to be paid for that dignity, you want to crawl right back into your holes and hand him over as a tribute. Go on, then. Grovel for Cain Blackwood. Beg him to put his boot back on your necks. And pray that this time, he only takes half of what you own." Her words were a bucket of ice water, shocking the crowd into a stunned, shamed silence. The righteous anger in their faces dissolved, replaced by the dawning and comfortable recognition of the truth. Into that silence, Elias finally spoke, his voice quiet but resonant, drawing every eye. "She's right," he said. "This is hard. And it's going to get harder. Blackwood thinks he has us in a cage. He's waiting for us to starve, to turn on each other, to break. He thinks we're just frightened sheep." A flicker of that cold fire returned to his pale eyes. "Tonight, we're going to prove him wrong. We're not going to wait for him to starve us. We're going to show the wolf that the sheep have grown teeth." The siege had forced a transformation upon him. The vengeful ghost of Whisper Creek had been supplanted by the reluctant general of Red Mesa. He was no longer just fighting for his past, he was fighting for their future. The meeting turned from a potential mutiny into a council of war. Elias's calm authority, backed by Maria's fierce passion, galvanized the townsfolk. They had reached their breaking point and had chosen not to shatter, but to harden into something new. Under his direction, the town began to fight back. The first target was their most critical need, water. Elias knew that Blackwood would have left a small guard at the makeshift Domino to warn him of a large force, but not enough to repel a small, determined one. Under the cloak of a moonless night, he led a small, hand-picked team out of the sleeping town. The team consisted of himself, Maria, whose knowledge of the local terrain was encyclopedic, and Ben Carter, whose raw strength would be indispensable. They moved like ghosts through the desert, using dry creek beds and shadowy roads to bypass Blackwood's distant patrols. They reached the dam canyon near midnight. As Elias had predicted, 4 of Blackwood's men were camped there, their figures illuminated by a small, lazy campfire. They were confident, careless, laughing and sharing a bottle of whiskey, believing themselves to be perfectly safe. That carelessness was their undoing. Elias and his team executed the attack with silent, brutal precision. There were no gunshots. Elias moved like a shadow, his new Bowie knife a whisper of steel in the darkness, dispatching one guard from behind. At the same moment, Maria, using the butt of her rifle, knocked another unconscious. Ben Carter, moving with surprising speed for a man his size, simply lifted the third man off his feet and broke his neck with a single, terrible twist. The fourth, realizing what was happening, scrambled for his gun, but Elias was on him in a flash, the fight ending before it truly began. It was not a battle, it was a swift and merciless removal of an obstacle. Then came the Herculean task. The rock slide was a jumble of massive boulders and scree. Using thick ropes from Maria's saddle and long, heavy-duty pry bars Ben had forged for this exact purpose, they began the back-breaking work. For hours, they strained, their muscles screaming in protest, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, they found the keystone, a massive boulder wedged precariously against the canyon wall. With a combined, desperate effort, they managed to shift it. With a deep, grinding groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, the dam gave way. A cascade of smaller stones and gravel turned into a torrent as the freed river, their town's lifeblood, surged through the gap. The sound of the rushing water was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. They returned to Red Mesa as the first hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky, exhausted, bruised, but victorious. They were met not with cheers, but with the quiet, tearful gratitude of the townspeople, who were already lining up at the well, watching the muddy trickle transform back into a steady, life-giving flow. They had not just reclaimed their water, they had reclaimed their soul. The siege was not over, but Red Mesa was no longer a victim. It was a fighter. Cain Blackwood received the news of the freed river and his dead guards with a calm so profound it terrified his men more than any outburst of rage. He stood in the center of his mission's courtyard, listening to the report from a scout, his face an unreadable, handsome mask. He understood now. He had underestimated his opponent. Elias Thorne was not just a gunfighter seeking personal revenge. He was a leader, a strategist, a man capable of inspiring loyalty and orchestrating complex operations. Cain had been trying to kill a town when he should have been focused on killing the man. He had been swatting at the hornet's nest when he should have been killing the queen. He summoned his most valuable asset, a taciturn Apache scout named Cale. Cale was not a thug or a killer. He was a master of his craft, a man who could read the desert like a book. He could track a single man across miles of sun-baked rock where a lesser man would see no sign at all. Cain assembled a posse of his 10 best riders, men who were skilled hunters and trackers in their own right. Their orders were simple and absolute. "He will try to draw you away from the town," Cain told them, his voice soft but carrying the chilling weight of command. "Let him. I don't care where he runs. Cale will find him. You will hunt him, you will corner him, and you will kill him. I want his head brought to me in a sack. Is that understood?" Elias knew they would be coming for him personally. The attack on the dam was a direct challenge, an insult Blackwood could not ignore. He also knew that as long as he remained in Red Mesa, the town was the target. He had become the lightning rod for Blackwood's rage, and he had to draw that lightning away from the innocent. He made a decision that seemed like madness to Maria and the others. He would ride out alone. "You're turning yourself into bait," Maria argued, her voice tight with worry as he saddled his chestnut stallion, Inferno. "I'm turning myself into the hunter," he corrected her gently. "They think they're the posse, but I'll be leading them. Not the other way around." He rode out at dawn, not trying to hide his trail, but making it deliberately obvious, a clear and arrogant invitation. He was a lone rider heading into the vast, empty expanse of the high desert, a single, defiant figure challenging an army to come and get him. The chase began within hours. Cale and the posse found his trail with ease and spurred their horses in pursuit. What followed was a grueling, 2-day-long game of cat and mouse played out across a landscape of breathtaking beauty and lethal danger. Elias was a phantom, always just ahead, a dark speck on the horizon. He was a master horseman, and Inferno was a marvel of stamina and intelligence. He led them through a labyrinth of treacherous box canyons where a single misstep meant a fatal plunge, forcing the larger posse to slow to a crawl. He galloped across wide, sun-blasted mesas, using the shimmering heat haze as a cloak, making him an impossible target for their long-range rifles. He pushed himself and his horse to the absolute limits of endurance, surviving on a few hours of sleep and sips of water from his canteen, his senses always on high alert. But the posse was relentless. Cale was as good as his reputation, and they never lost the trail for long. Slowly, inexorably, they began to close the distance. Elias could feel their presence behind him, a constant pressure, a promise of impending violence. This was all part of his plan. He was not running from them. He was leading them to a place he had scouted weeks before, a place marked on an old Spanish map simply as Boca del Diablo, Devil's Jawbone. He entered the Jawbone at dusk. It was a tortuous maze of narrow, winding slot canyons, the red rock walls rising hundreds of feet straight up, so close together in places that they almost blotted out the sky. The setting sun cast the canyons into a confusing patchwork of deep shadow and blinding light. Here, 10 men were no stronger than one. Here, the advantage shifted from the hunter to the hunted. He dismounted, his face a mask of grim focus. He led Inferno into a deep, hidden alcove, muffling the horse's muzzle to ensure its silence. He was no longer the prey. He was the predator, and he had just led the wolves into his trap. With the silent grace of a mountain cat, he began to climb the steep, sheer canyon wall, using tiny handholds and footholds that would have been invisible to anyone else. He positioned himself on a narrow ledge overlooking the main passage, his rifle resting on the rock before him. He became one with the stone and shadow, and he waited. The posse rode into the canyon 20 minutes later, their figures stark silhouettes against the last crimson glow of the evening sky. They were tired, frustrated, and overconfident, believing they finally had their quarry cornered. Elias let them ride into the deepest, narrowest part of the canyon. Then he opened fire. The first shot, amplified by the enclosed space to a deafening roar, took the lead rider from his saddle. Before the others could even react, he worked the lever of his rifle, firing with a calm, deadly rhythm. His position gave him a perfect vantage point. He was firing down into a confused, panicked mass of men and horses. A second man fell, then a third. Panic erupted. The outlaws were trapped in a stone shooting gallery, the lethal bullets coming from an unseen enemy. Only Cale, the Apache tracker, reacted with the instinct of a true warrior. He dove from his horse the moment the first shot was fired, rolling behind a large boulder and bringing his own rifle up, his shots chipping stone uncomfortably close to Elias's head. The remaining riders, their nerve broken, tried to turn and flee, to escape the deadly trap. But Elias had anticipated this. He had planted a small dynamite charge, taken from Ben's forge, at the narrow entrance to the canyon. He drew his Colt, took careful aim, and fired. The bullet struck the blasting cap, and with a tremendous boom, the canyon entrance collapsed in a cloud of dust and a cascade of rock, sealing them in. The fight was over quickly after that. Trapped between the rock slide and the hawk in his nest, the remaining outlaws were systematically eliminated. In the end, only the sound of the wind and the echo of the last shot remained. Elias climbed down, his rifle in one hand, his Colt in the other. He and Cale faced each other in the sudden, profound silence of the moonlit canyon. The Apache had not been hit. He stood by the rock, his rifle empty, his expression calm, accepting his fate. Elias walked toward him, his own face grim. He saw in the tracker's eyes not the evil of Blackwood's other man, but the quiet dignity of a warrior. He would not kill this man. He will not stop, Cale said, his voice a low rasp. This will only make him send more. I know, Elias replied. He motioned with his pistol. Drop the gun belt. There's a way out over the north ridge. It's a 2-day walk back to the mission. He holstered his own pistol and held out a canteen. This is for the water, not for the company you keep. Cale hesitated, then nodded slowly. He did as he was told. Before he turned to leave, he looked at Elias. You hunt a devil. You may have to become one to kill him. Elias watched him go, a lone figure climbing into the darkness. The chase was over. He had won a stunning victory, but Cale's words echoed in his mind. He had decimated Blackwood's best hunters, but the devil himself still sat on his throne, and now his hatred would be absolute. The time for running and trapping was over. The only way to end this was to walk into the serpent's lair. Elias did not return to Red Mesa immediately. He let the town believe he was still out in the desert, drawing Blackwood's attention. Instead, he circled wide, using the knowledge gleaned from his brief but intense conversation with Cale to approach Serpent's Tooth from the south, the one direction from which an attack was deemed impossible due to the sheer cliffs. For 2 days, he observed the mission from a distance, hidden in a rocky outcropping, studying the routines of the guards, the layout of the buildings, the very rhythm of his enemy's stronghold. He was no longer just a gunfighter. The battle in the Devil's Jawbone had taught him a valuable lesson. He could not win this war alone, and he could not win it on the defensive. The only way to save Red Mesa was to cut the head off the serpent in its own lair. He slipped back into town under the cover of a starless night, a ghost returning to a town of ghosts. He went directly to the blacksmith's forge, where he knew he would find his allies. He gathered his small, nascent militia Maria, Ben Carter, Sheriff Thorne, and a handful of other ranchers whose faces were now hard and set with resolve. He unrolled a crude map he had drawn in the dust of his hideout, scratching the layout of the mission onto a piece of old leather. Blackwood's fortress is here, he said, his finger tapping the drawing. He has at least 20 men still with him. The walls are high, the main gate is the only way in, and it's always guarded. A direct assault is suicide. So what's the plan, son? Sheriff Thorne asked, his voice steady. He was a changed man. The fire Elias had lit had burned away the years of fear, leaving behind the core of the lawman he had once been. Blackwood is arrogant, Elias explained, his pale eyes intense in the lamplight. He believes he's untouchable in his fortress. He won't be expecting an attack on his own ground. We are going to give him one. But we are not going in to fight his army. We are going in to cripple it. His finger moved to a small, squat building he had marked at the far end of the mission's central plaza. This is his powder magazine. It's where he stores his entire arsenal: dynamite, rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition. Without it, his gang is just a pack of thugs with pistols. We get in, we blow the magazine, and we get out. We take away his ability to wage war. The plan was audacious, reckless, bordering on suicidal. A long silence filled the forge as the others absorbed the sheer danger of it. It was Maria who spoke first. "When do we leave?" The journey to Serpent's Tooth was a tense, silent pilgrimage. The strike team was small and specialized: Elias, the leader and strategist; Maria, the scout, whose keen eyes and steady hand with a rifle were invaluable; and Ben Carter, the heavy artillery, carrying a satchel packed with carefully bundled sticks of dynamite from the town's mining supplies. They traveled only by night, hiding during the brutal heat of the day, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were marching toward the heart of their enemy's power. On the second night, the mission loomed before them, a black, jagged silhouette against a sky full of cold, distant stars. Getting inside was the first, and perhaps most difficult, challenge. Elias, acting on information he had pressed out of Cale, led them not to the main gate, but to a section of the crumbling rear wall, a relic of the original Spanish construction that Blackwood had never bothered to fully repair. It was hidden from the main courtyard by a thick, thorny growth of chaparral. Under the cover of the darkest hour before dawn, using ropes and sheer grit, they scaled the wall, silent as ascending spirits. They dropped into the shadows inside the fortress. The place was a small, self-contained town of villainy. Campfires dotted the main plaza, their flames illuminating the rough, cruel faces of Blackwood's men. The air was filled with the sounds of their drunken laughter, coarse jokes, and the occasional splintering crash of a bottle thrown against a wall. It was a vision of a lawless, brutal hell. Elias, Maria, and Ben moved through the deep shadows at the edge of the plaza, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. They were three quiet mice in a den of sleeping wolves. They crept along the walls, heading toward their target, the squat, heavily guarded stone building at the far end of the plaza, the powder magazine. Two guards stood at its thick wooden door, their rifles held loosely, their attention more on a nearby campfire than on the darkness behind them. As they crouched behind a stack of supply crates, waiting for the perfect moment, the main doors of the chapel which Blackwood used as his personal quarters swung open. Cain Blackwood himself stepped out, followed by a handful of his lieutenants. His arm was in a clean white sling, but he moved with the same predatory grace. His voice, cool and commanding, carried clearly across the plaza in the still night air. What they overheard turned their blood to ice. Blackwood was no longer planning the siege. His patience had been exhausted. His pride had been wounded. His rage was now absolute. "The time for games is over," Blackwood announced to his men, his voice ringing with a chilling finality. "Tomorrow at dawn, we ride. Every man. We will not ask for tribute. We will not make examples. We will ride into Red Mesa, and we will burn it to the last splinter of wood. We will salt the earth where it stood. I want nothing left. I want no survivors. I want the name Red Mesa to become a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to children. I want the world to know what happens when you defy me." The mission had just become a race against time. They had until dawn to save their town from annihilation. There was no more time for stealth. Ben Carter opened his satchel. As Maria raised her rifle, her sights settling on the two guards at the magazine, Elias and Ben worked with frantic, desperate speed, placing the dynamite charges at the base of the magazine's thick wooden door and along its stone foundation. They were setting the last fuse when a lone guard, returning from the latrine, stumbled into the alleyway where they were working. His eyes widened, his mouth opening to shout a warning. Maria's rifle cracked once. The sound was like the sky splitting open, shockingly, catastrophically loud in the relative quiet of the mission. The guard crumpled to the ground without a sound. But it was too late. The shot had sounded the alarm. Across the plaza, shouts erupted. Men scrambled for their guns. The entire fortress was waking up, a hornet's nest stirred to a killing frenzy. "It's now or never," Elias yelled over the growing din. He struck a match, the small flame impossibly bright in the darkness, and touched it to the main fuse. It sputtered to life, a small, angry snake of fire racing toward the tons of black powder and dynamite just beyond the door. Go? Go now? The world detonated. There was a silent, blinding flash of white light that bleached all color from the world, followed a microsecond later by a deafening, concussive roar that felt as if the sky itself had been torn in half. The powder magazine did not just explode, it ceased to exist. A massive, roiling mushroom cloud of fire, smoke, and splintered timber shot hundreds of feet into the night sky, momentarily turning midnight into noon. The shockwave radiated outwards like a physical blow, smashing windows, tearing doors from their hinges, and sending men who were running toward the sound tumbling through the air like rag dolls. The Outlaws' arsenal, the source of Blackwood's power, was now a roaring, incandescent crater. In the first few seconds of stunned chaos that followed, Elias, Maria, and Ben scrambled for the wall. The fortress had become a scene from Dante's Inferno. The plaza was a maelstrom of fire and confusion. Enraged, disoriented outlaws poured from the barracks, firing their pistols wildly into the swirling smoke and shadows, shooting at anything that moved. They were halfway to their escape route when a stray bullet, fired at random, found its mark. It caught Ben Carter in the thick muscle of his thigh, and the big blacksmith went down with a sharp grunt of pain, his leg buckling beneath him. Elias and Maria didn't hesitate. They each grabbed one of his arms, dragging their wounded friend behind a large, overturned water wagon, the wood splintering around them as more bullets found their range. And then he appeared. Like a demon emerging from the flames of hell, Cain Blackwood strode out of the main chapel. The explosion had torn the sling from his arm, and his wounded shoulder was bleeding freely, but he seemed not to notice. His handsome face was a demonic mask of pure, unadulterated fury, his eyes reflecting the fires that raged around him. He held a silver-inlaid revolver in each hand, and his gaze, sweeping across the chaos, possessed a terrifying, focused intensity. It swept past the screaming, burning men, past the collapsing buildings, and locked onto the shadows behind the water wagon. It found Elias. For the first time in 5 long, bitter years, the two men who had once been brothers were face to face. In that instant, the battle raging around them, the shouts, the screams, the gunfight all seemed to fade away into a distant, irrelevant roar. Their world shrank to the 50 yards of firelit, blood-soaked ground that separated them. Elias Blackwood's voice was not a shout, but a raw, guttural roar of pure hatred that seemed to tear its way from his soul. "You have been a thorn in my side for the last time. This ends tonight, Cain," Elias shouted back, his own voice raw with the grief and rage of 5 years. He rose from behind the wagon, his Colt bucking in his hand. The bullet splintered the stone lip of the well that Blackwood was using for cover. Cain returned fire, his own twin revolvers barking in response, the shots chewing up the wood of the wagon, sending splinters flying past Elias's head. It was a frantic, desperate firefight at the epicenter of a larger battle. Maria, her face a mask of concentration, laid down a steady, accurate covering fire with her rifle, forcing a group of outlaws who were trying to flank them to duck for cover, buying Elias precious seconds. The air was a thick, choking soup of smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. "You took everything from me," Elias yelled, ejecting spent cartridges and reloading with practiced, desperate speed. "My home, my family, my life. They stood in the way of destiny," Blackwood screamed back, his voice cracking with a chilling, messianic fervor. "You were a fool, Elias. A small man, content to live and die in the dirt. I offered you an empire. I would have made you a king. You offered me a kingdom of ashes," Elias roared, firing again. He knew they couldn't win a prolonged siege. They were 3 people, one of them wounded, against a fortress of killers. He had to end this. He had to break the stalemate. He laid down a rapid volley of 3 shots, forcing Blackwood to stay deep behind the well. Then, he did the unthinkable. He charged. He vaulted over a burning ammunition crate, his duster flying out behind him, landing in the open ground just yards from his enemy. The raw, primal fury of the attack took Blackwood by surprise. The 2 men crashed into each other, their guns knocked from their hands. It was no longer a gunfight. It was a savage, desperate brawl, a brutal contest of will fueled by years of poisonous hatred. They grappled, their hands locking on each other's throats, and crashed backward through the great doors of the chapel. They landed in a heap inside the sanctuary, the pews and religious icons now lit by the hellish, flickering light of the burning plaza outside. Elias drove the heel of his palm into Kane's nose, the crunch of cartilage sickeningly loud. But Blackwood was a powerful, desperate man. He roared and slammed Elias backward, his head cracking against the hard stone of the altar, making the world explode in a flash of white stars. Blackwood scrambled for a long, wicked-looking knife that had fallen from his belt. "I should have made sure you were dead in Whisper Creek," he hissed, his face a mask of insanity, raising the blade to plunge it into Elias's heart. At that moment, Maria appeared in the shattered doorway, her rifle raised. She had been propped against the wagon, his pistol in his hand, to cover their escape. She fired her last bullet. The shot caught Kane in his already wounded shoulder. He screamed, a sound of pure agony, the knife clattering to the stone floor. The momentary distraction was all Elias needed. His vision clearing, he kicked out with both feet, his boots catching Blackwood in the chest and sending him stumbling backward into a row of pews. Knowing they were out of time, out of ammunition, and on the verge of being overrun, Elias made a gut-wrenching choice. He couldn't kill Blackwood now, not without sacrificing himself and his friends. He scrambled to his feet. "Maria, go." With Maria laying down a final, desperate covering fire with her now empty rifle, using it as a club against the first outlaws to breach the chapel, Elias half ran, half stumbled from the church. He grabbed the wounded Ben, slinging the big man's arm over his shoulders, and together, the three of them fought their way back to the wall. They escaped into the darkness just as the first rays of dawn began to touch the sky, leaving behind them a burning, crippled fortress and a wounded, enraged devil. They had survived the serpent's lair, but they all knew the wounded serpent was now slithering toward their home for one final, apocalyptic battle. Dawn broke over the high desert, not with the gentle pastels of a new day, but with the angry, blood-red slash of a fresh wound. On the eastern horizon, a dark line appeared, thick and menacing. It was not a dust cloud raised by the wind. It was Kane Blackwood and what remained of his gang, 30 desperate, half-broken, but murderously enraged men, riding hard for Red Mesa. There was no strategy left, no thought of subjugation or tribute. This was a ride of pure, nihilistic vengeance. Kane, his arm hastily bandaged, his face a pale, taut mask of agony and hatred, wanted to erase the town, and the men who had defied him, from the face of the earth. But Red Mesa was not the same town they had terrorized for years. It was not a town of victims. The few precious hours of warning bought by the strike team's heroic return had been used to transform the dusty, vulnerable streets into a fortress. The news of the mission's success, of the destruction of Blackwood's arsenal, had spread like wildfire, burning away the last vestiges of fear and replacing it with a hard, defiant courage. Under Elias's direction, the town had prepared for its final stand. The main street was a barricade of overturned wagons, their wheels removed, the gaps stuffed with sandbags and reinforced with iron plates forged by Ben Carter before he collapsed from his wound. Every man and woman who could hold a firearm was in position, on the rooftops, at the windows of the second-story buildings, behind the barricades. Their faces were grim, their knuckles white on their weapons, but their eyes were clear and steady. They were no longer sheep. They were a militia, fighting for their homes, their families, their lives. At the center of it all, standing in the middle of the street behind the main barricade, was Elias, the Phoenix. He was calm, a rock in the midst of a turbulent sea. His face, etched with exhaustion, was set like stone. His pale gray eyes watched the approaching riders, and in them, there was no fear. There was only the quiet, final acceptance of a man who had finally met his destiny. The battle for Red Mesa began not with a charge, but with a roar of collective defiance from the town. As Blackwood's gang galloped into rifle range, Elias gave a single, sharp command: fire. A ragged but deafening volley of rifle fire erupted from every window and rooftop. The disciplined, withering fire tore into the front rank of the outlaws. Men and horses screamed and tumbled in the dust in a chaotic, bloody heap. The outlaws, accustomed to inspiring terror, were stunned by the ferocity and accuracy of the resistance. Their wild, vengeful charge broke apart, dissolving into a desperate, chaotic firefight in the streets. The battle was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The air quickly became a thick, choking fog of gun smoke, so dense that it was hard to see more than a few yards ahead. The outlaws, fighting with the savagery of cornered animals, dismounted, and used their dead horses for cover, trying to advance. But the townspeople, guided by Elias's shouted commands, held their ground with a courage they never knew they possessed. Maria Flores was a lioness on the roof of the Mercantile, her Winchester speaking with a steady, deadly authority, picking off any outlaw who dared to show his head. Sheriff Thorne, his fear a distant memory, fought from the window of his office like the lawman of his youth, his shotgun booming, a righteous force of order against chaos. Amidst the swirling pandemonium, Elias moved like a wraith. He was everywhere at once, his black-handled Colt a blur of motion. He appeared at a weak point in the barricade to drop to advancing outlaws, then vanished into the smoke, only to reappear on a rooftop, providing covering fire for a group of ranchers pinned down in the street. His presence was a beacon, his calm a source of strength for the embattled defenders. Finally, through a momentary clearing in the smoke, the two leaders found each other. Cain Blackwood, his face contorted in a mask of pain and madness, had advanced to within 50 yards of the main barricade. He and Elias locked eyes. In that instant, a silent and spoken truce seemed to fall over their small patch of ground. The raging battle around them became a distant, muffled backdrop. This was their fight. It had always been their fight, from the first lie in a green valley to this final, bloody street. It ends here, Elias, Blackwood snarled, discarding his empty rifle and drawing his remaining silver-inlaid revolver, the one pristine thing left in his shattered world. It ended 5 years ago, Elias replied, his voice cold and clear as the desert night. You just haven't paid the bill yet. Their duel was brutally, beautifully simple. There was no ceremony, no posturing, no counting off paces. There was only the history, the hatred, and the speed of their hands. They drew as one. Two guns boomed, the sounds so close together they were almost indistinguishable. A red flower blossomed on the chest of Cain Blackwood's dusty coat. He stared down at it, a look of profound, almost childlike surprise on his face, as if he could not comprehend his own mortality. He looked up at Elias, a silent, final question in his eyes, before his knees buckled. He pitched forward into the dust of the town he had tried to destroy, his reign of terror finally, utterly over. Elias stood for a long second, motionless. Then, he looked down at his own left side. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across his ash-colored duster. He had been hit. The sight of their leader falling shattered the outlaws' will to fight. Their attack dissolved into a panicked, desperate scramble to escape. They fled into the desert, pursued by the last, vengeful shots of the victorious townspeople. As an eerie silence descended, broken only by the crackle of a few small fires and the groans of the wounded, the people of Red Mesa emerged from their positions. They were battered, bleeding, but they were alive. And they were free. They gathered around Elias, who had sunk to one knee, his hand pressed tightly against his side. Doc Miller rushed to his side, but Elias held up a hand, stopping him. He looked up at the faces surrounding Heimat Maria, her face smudged with gunpowder but her eyes shining with tears of relief. At Sheriff Thorne, who stood taller than he had in years. At Ben, who had dragged himself to the doorway of his forge. He had come to this town as a ghost, an instrument of vengeance seeking only to quiet the screams of his past. He had found something else entirely. A community. A purpose. A home. His vengeance was complete, but the cold, hollow emptiness inside him was gone, replaced by the warmth of their gratitude and their courage. The story of what happened next became the founding legend of the new Red Mesa. Some say the Phoenix, his wound proving fatal, died that day in the street, his spirit finally at peace, and was buried in the town cemetery under a simple wooden cross that read only, "A friend." Others say he recovered, tended to by the grateful town, and that he stayed for a year, helping to rebuild. His quiet wisdom guiding them as they established a new town council and a true rule of law, before disappearing one night as mysteriously as he had arrived. But the version the children love best, the one told by old-timers in the Thirsty Gulch Saloon, is this: as the sun set that evening, casting long, peaceful shadows across the street, a lone figure, tall and lean in an ash-colored duster, rode his chestnut stallion out of town. He headed not south into the harsh desert of his past, but west, toward the setting sun and the promise of a new frontier. He didn't look back. His war was over. His fire had not consumed him. It had given life back to the embers of a dying town. And like the mythical bird for which he was named, the phoenix, having risen from the ashes to bring a terrible and beautiful justice, simply flew away, leaving behind not a legacy of death, but a legend of hope.